Hello, and welcome back to David Starkey Talks. Well, what an interesting few days. This extraordinary spectacle of the virtuous, the moralistic, the rule-abiding, the dedicated above all to public service, Sir Keir Starmer, KC, ex-director of public prosecutions, behaving really, well, a little bit like a shoplifter, hasn't he? Complete with Lady Victoria, Lady Vic, his lady wife. This extraordinary appetite for freebies, to be shoveled down, to be hospitality at Arsenal, to be enjoyed, special seats at Arsenal and at the St. Leger at Doncaster, where wicked cries arose from the unappreciative multitude. It's a bit like a Roman emperor, isn't it? Going into the box, up, down. Anyway, and most flagrantly, of course, clothes and spectacles, and the arraying of his wife like, an object of sacrifice. I mean, as people have pointed out quite gently, a man letting another man, even a gay one, buy clothes for his wife. My mother, my father was a toolmaker. Also, my mother, a really straight-backed, proper Puritan, would have known exactly what to describe a woman who had her clothes bought for her by a man who wasn't her husband. In fact, one lived next door to us, and my mother was completely certain what Mrs. S was. No better than she should be, or, if she was really very cross indeed, a kept woman. And yet, what's most extraordinary of all, isn't it? Starmer absolutely unable to see why anybody objects, despite the fact that he ranted and performed and postured at Boris Johnson, at Sunak, at everybody else, asserting his own virtue. So, of course, what we all do, we automatically resort to that lazy term, hypocrisy. See, I think there's something much more fundamental going on here, and it links not simply Starmer, but a whole clutch of other people who have behaved conspicuously badly recently and are also bound together in this strange thing called public service. For example, though one hesitates to kick anybody when they're down, Hugh Edwards, the BBC, the public service broadcaster, does have a very unfortunate run, doesn't it, with misbehaving, usually sexually in one form or another, star presenters, the public service. I wonder, in fact, and this is the point that I want to explore to you, whether the problem is with the very idea of public service, which sounds so good. And by the way, it has been the deliberate keynote that Starmer tried to push from the very beginning, from his speech in Downing Street, constantly on about, we are a government here to serve, we are the public service, we are bending, politics to the service of the working people, to this, that, and the other. And indeed, towards the end of his first speech, not up on the steps of Downing Street, but his first speech in the House of Commons itself, it descended into an extraordinary kind of Kamala Harris soup of working people. A word soup, a word salad. I think word soup is even better. Kind of terrible minestrone of public service, working people, me, virtue, virtue, virtue. So let's look at it. And I think what we can do is we'll find that it's a key to both Starmer's very odd and very disturbing psychology, but also to what really is the nature, and I'm going to use a term which I don't like using, what I would call the Starmer regime. Now, we use the word regime, of course, for governments which aren't legitimate or aren't fully legitimate. And it seems to me, I'm afraid, Starmer's Britain is rapidly going down that path, headed, of course, by this fatally misguided moralist Starmer himself. So where does this idea of public service come from? Well, Starmer offered another very interesting indication. Of course, we have been commemorating the second anniversary of the death of the late Queen Elizabeth II and the accession of King Charles III, and both of them are very closely associated with this idea of service. Indeed, Starmer's comments commemorating the Queen's death and mourning her focused on the fact that, of course, she had been resolutely devoted to the idea of service. Similarly, King Charles III's coronation began with an innovation. After the usual little choir boys who cry Vivat, Vivat Rex, in response to the cry of, will you have this man to be your, to the Archbishop, will you have this man to be your king? They're actually the boys of Westminster School. The choir boys cry Vivat, Vivat, Vivat Rex, long live the king, long live the king. But a new bit was added. One of them stepped forward and asked the king why he came here. And the answer came, to serve. So what is this word service? Where does it come from? Why is it so redolent in the church? And by the way, I think I'm right here. I seem to have read that Starmer's principal speechwriter actually cut his teeth, if we can use anything so muscular or sharp-edged, writing speeches for Archbishop Welby. So again, some other interesting connections there. Where does this idea of service come from? Well, the business of the Archbishop's speechwriter points us in a key direction. It is a Christian concept. You will find in the Bible this extraordinary idea from St. Paul talking about the need for the absolute submission to God and to God's will. He uses two very interesting Latin words, which are very, very strong words. To whom, cui, servare est regnare, whom to serve. Servare. Actually, it doesn't mean serve. It means to whom to be a slave. Servare. The slavery, remember, is the key institution of the ancient world. It's nothing very peculiar, in fact, very unpeculiar to the poor old, much attacked British Empire. To whom to serve, to be a slave, is to reign, regnare. Now, Cranmer, when he came to translate that for the Book of Common Prayer, comes up with this wonderful phrase in which he shifts it, whose service is perfect freedom. So the idea of serving God, doing what God tells us to, obeying the divine injunctions as the ultimate moral criterion, which at the same time that you are bound to a set of rules in Christian doctrine, also frees you. Right, so that's the big idea. This big idea has shifted in all sorts of different directions in its time, but it became very, very useful to the Windsor monarchy. I've talked a lot about this, the reformation of the royal house, the royal family, in 1917, which shifted the royal household in all sorts of different ways. It nationalised it, it stopped it being a German dynasty, it turned it into an English family. It was also part of a much bigger shift by which for example, the pleasure-loving monarchies of George IV, or much more recently at that point, George V's father, Edward VII, princes of pleasure, both of them, were replaced by a very different idea, which was the monarch as servant of their people. Literally, cui servare est regnare. To serve is to reign, which again is the idea that's very neatly fitted in at the beginning of King Charles III's coronation. And of course, that idea spreads in all sorts of ways, the renaming of the army and the bureaucracy as the civil service, particularly the armed services and their direct relationship to the crown. It's also something else, again, which is very characteristic of 1917, the complete transformation of the honours system from merely really being the recognition of nobility, political power, hugely important military prowess, with a tiny number of orders, a tiny number of places in the three great orders of the Garter, of the in England, of the Thistle in Scotland, and of the Patrick in Ireland. You know, they're all a couple of dozen each. You'd had to enlarge it at the beginning of the 18th century as the British Army, and particularly the British Navy, start to get much bigger with the real onset of empire. You'd created the Order of the Bath. But in 1917, there's this vast multiplication with the creation of the Order of the British Empire. And how you get one of these things, ladies and gentlemen, is for services too. It's the sort of idea that you've gone one better. You've done more than you needed to. So if I boast of mine, my CBE, it is for services to history. On the grounds of a reasonably good historian, I'd done quite a lot to propagandise for it, and been an all-round, you know, once upon a time it was thought at any rate, good chap in disseminating an important branch of human knowledge. So this idea of services. Now, how does that all tie together? Well, what it is, how does it link Starmer? How does it link the monarchy? How does it link Hugh Edwards? How does it link another thing? We've been talking about misbehaviour. How can we put forward something else? We could also describe Starmer's brutal absolutely ruthless acquisitiveness. We could describe it too, couldn't we, as selfishness. I mean, would that not, for example, be an entirely appropriate description of the behaviour of the junior doctors, or, for example, of the railway workers, of the train drivers? I mean, absolutely grasping and wringing from the public purse the maximum amount that they can, and in both cases inflicting very considerable amounts of suffering. And I would argue straightforwardly, in the case of junior doctors, actual loss of life, that they regard their benefits as so important that they are prepared to do things which, if they were not protected by trade union law, would actively be considered, I think, as a crime. Right? But public service justifies this. So we're getting something very odd here, aren't we? What is it? Well, I think Starmer's own position is this. If you have this idea that there's something special about the public service, it actually empowers you. What seems to link all these things, the selfishness, the train drivers, the junior doctors, Hugh Edwards, J. Blades, even Charles III himself, with his extraordinary combination of personal luxury and personal self-indulgence and encouragement of the rest of us to virtue. What links all these things? Well, clearly, it's an extraordinary sense of entitlement or hypocrisy, but it's beyond that, isn't it? What gives you that sense? Well, you see, I think there are two things, and they're very closely linked. And they tell us, I think, an awful lot about Starmer, and they tell us an awful lot about Charles III, and they tell us an awful lot about Archbishop Welby. The two things are what the public service is not. The idea of the public service is very hostile to two other things. It's very hostile. It's not for profit. What defines all these things is they have nothing whatever to do with the filthy business of filthy lucre, or at least making filthy lucre. They're very happy to take other people's making of filthy lucre, and indeed they regard themselves as having a quite extraordinary entitlement to it. As you know, the public service now takes at least 40% of everything you, I, and everybody else in the private sector makes. It could be described, couldn't it, as being quite extraordinarily parasitic, but it has the virtue that it's not for profit. Again, this idolization within the National Health Service. Oh, there's no charging. It's free at the point of use. It's a kind of, isn't it? It's a kind of, again, this quasi-religious edge to this. It's a sort of sanctification. It's like sprinkling holy water on something, isn't it? Or pronouncing, the magic words, hoc est corpus. This is not for profit, therefore it's virtuous. Virtuous. Hugh Edwards, Keir Starmer, Lady Victoria, J. Blades, Charles III. And there's another thing that it's not, that it's very firmly not. It's not to do, oh, heaven forbid, it's not to do with politics. Absolutely not. And this is where I think both Starmer and his appropriation of what we're now seeing, what Starmer's doing when he's using this constant word service and public service, he is deliberately appropriating a royal or ecclesiastical language. He's deliberately hardly putting himself in the position of Queen Elizabeth II, but he would certainly seem to be wheeling his wife into that kind of position. It's a kind of rule by virtue, by none of these vulgar things called politics, of doing deals, of listening to what people want. It's there because, well, presumably you know best, religiously, of course. Well, I suppose you do know best. You've got the Bible. If you pray a lot, you think, at least, I gather, or you used to, that you've got a kind of hotline to God, which, enables you to tell other people what to do. Which is why, again, I think, although I don't want to push the Puritan business here, but there is clearly another element of Starmer, which is a classic Puritan. I know a little bit about it. I was brought up within Quakerism. My mother was a kind of riddled with most of the problems of Puritanism, poor dear woman. But I also did something else. As a young man, teenager, I played one of the great Puritans of literature. I played Malvolio in Twelfth Night. And there's that marvellous moment, Malvolio again, preening, imagining that Olivia, the lady of his household, was in love with him, wearing ludicrous clothes, Keir Starmer, cross-gartered, though I think Lord Ali, by the way, used to be wonderfully known by private eye when it was funny. His name is Wahid Ali, used to be known as Lord Wahid Boy, having the same kind of characteristics of fairly targeted generosity. Anyway, so let's go back to Malvolio. So Malvolio, cross-gartered, but also, of course, preening, imagining that the world is in love with him. But also, as Toby Belch, his great opponent, says, listen to this carefully, dost thou think, because thou art virtuous, there shall be no more cakes and ale. Think of all these new health taxes we're going to have, which happen to fall very much on cakes and ale, or why the particular resonance of the attack on Boris Johnson exactly over Cakegate. This notion of a higher virtue that enables you to say to other people, well, you see, that you're indulgent my receiving nice things, my dressing up my wife like a mannequin, literally in borrowed couture clothes, my dressing up my wife. Lord Ali dressing it better still. He's probably got much better taste, being a gay man, dressing up my wife as a mannequin. That is virtuous. That is expressing. That's showing the pride in our country, etc., etc. So we're getting, aren't we now, to this really very interesting complex of things. The public service, this terrible, deadly word, accrues to itself the virtue of not being about profit. In other words, it steals money. Taxation is theft. It's legitimated theft if the state actually delivers something. Otherwise, it is straightforwardly and simply theft. And as inefficient and as incompetent and as self-indulgent as our state is, I'm afraid it inclines much more to straightforward theft than to anything else. But it's also this other complex of ideas, isn't it? The complex of ideas of that it's not political. This is very striking. This was fundamentally what was brought in with the coronation of King Charles III. From 1689, the foundation of our modern state in the Glorious Revolution, right up to the coronation of King Charles III, in other words, up to the coronation of his mother in 1953, the coronation had fundamentally been a sanctification of the political process. Parliament, right from 1689, both the House of Lords, actually forming the main kind of chorus troupe in the grand opera of the coronation, and the House of Commons up there in a principal gallery, the entire house headed by the Speaker looking down at the extraordinary performance below, had been present. And the entire service was God's benediction on the process of politics. All of that was eliminated from the coronation of Charles III. It's quite extraordinary. I pointed it out at the time, but nobody else picked it up. And instead, the House of Commons went, most of the House of Lords went, and the very idea of the sanctification of politics went, and the political process and the state went. And instead, well, there was all this prattle about love and all being in it together. Profoundly anti-political. But ladies and gentlemen, politics is how we are free. I know we've given it a bad name, but the alternative is the public service. It's the idea that our ruler, I'm going to use that word, because Keir Starmer, of course, has absolutely, fundamentally anti-democratic instincts. He sees himself as being possessed of some sort of special knowledge, some kind of virtue that elevates him above. That constant referring back to being chief prosecutor, finding it easy to be ruthless. These are profoundly disturbing things. So we've got then a particular psychology of an individual, and we've got a particular attitude of mind, which I'm afraid now embraces what I would want to call a new ruling class. So we've got the sense of public service, what it's not. It's about not being for profit. In other words, the exclusion, really, of all business. It's not about politics, because, of course, politics implies there are two sides to the question. Starmer, like the whole of the modern left, denies that. He sees the Conservatives, which is why he's spending the whole of his time trying to demonise the previous government. He simply sees them as not simply wrong, but wicked. And he sees himself not only as right, but right imbued with virtue. In other words, an essentially Platonic view. He sees himself, not of course as a philosopher king, but he sees himself as a lawyer king. knowing the rules by which he and the rest of us should live. But of course, it's not simply Starmer. Starmer is a very representative figure. He's a representative figure of not simply the idea of public service, but the public service. Once upon a time, the Labour Party has always seen itself in class terms. The Labour Party thought of itself as the politically organised arm of the working class. Now the Labour Party has become something different. It is the non-political universalist arm, the Platonic arm of the new governing elite, not the working class, not working people. They're the mere cannon fodder for this process. It's the public sector, which embraces what? Well, it embraces the vast, inconceivably vast structures of the NHS. 2 million people. 2 million people. It embraces most of the teaching profession. It embraces the universities. It embraces the vast teeming structures of local government. It embraces, of course, the quangos, the quasi-autonomous, non-governmental organisations that now proliferate in ever larger numbers and do more and more that should actually be done by the agents of the state, which at least are subject to some nominal form of democratic override. So in other words, the endless multitudes that populate the Bank of England, the Climate Change Committee, riddled from top to bottom with self-interest, but self-interest, of course, in the name of virtue, in the name of saving the planet. There is, of course, alongside the quangos, and especially in the sector of renewable fuels, there's an entire mass of crony capitalism of companies that merely depend on handouts from the state, with figures like Dale Vince, notable patrons of the Labour Party, merely, frankly, recycling the amount of money that they get in subsidies for their electrically produced windmills producing immensely expensive and irregular electricity. So we have this enormous and developing structure. It's what, in one of his better moments, of course, Michael Gove called the blob. So the public sector, the public service is what? We can now see it for what it is. It is, to paraphrase Lincoln, it is the rule of the blob, by the blob, for the blob, with the Labour Party being the new Labour Party, the Change Labour Party, Starmer's Labour Party, being the final sanctimonious coping stone on the whole rotting structure. And talking of it as a rotting structure reminds us of something else. I mentioned before the interesting analysis by Neil Ferguson saying much of the West was displaying the same, as it were, overall sense of decay as the late Soviet Union. This structure of the state, of auxiliary organizations, of the bureaucracy, of the universities, of the teachers, all of that in the Soviet Union was known as the nomenklatura. And do you know what? Well, it was a little bit like ours, because what I haven't mentioned, I've talked about the sense of entitlement, but the entitlement isn't simply freebies. Would that it were. It is, of course, too, well, as we've seen from the doctors, from the train drivers, from the school teachers, from everybody else, it is the right to superabundant remuneration. It's the right also to early retirement. Civil service, I think, still retiring at 60. It's the right to spectacularly enhanced pensions. It is only in the public sector that the defined benefits still really obtain. In the private sector, you are actually left. Sorry, let's get this right. The private sector, dear me, let's get through it. The private sector has had to abandon the kind of final salary schemes which are typical of the public sector, simply on grounds of cost. To give you an illustration, the amount of money at which the government puts in to each civil servant's pension, in other words, to keep, remember there is no fund, it's very important we realise this, this is simply the Ponzi scheme that keeps the present pensioners going out of the money that's paid in by the employer-employee, that's to say the government and the civil service. Do you know how much it actually takes? It takes 28% of salary as the employer, that's the government, that's yours and mine, contribution to each civil servant's pension. In industry, in the non-public sector, in that bit devoted to filthy profit and self-aggrandizement, you're lucky if your employer's contribution is 8%, which is why you have the thing called the defined benefit scheme, and you are at the mercy of the stock market or the general qualities of your investment, not if you are in the public sector. So we now have this highly privileged group of people. Oh, they're privileged in other ways too, aren't they? They have enhanced access to honours. Look at the cascade of honours that descend upon the Paula Venels of this world. You know, Paula Venels wasn't atypical. Well, she burned her fingers, but the attitude of mind that's represented by it, well, it penetrates, I think, much, if not most, of the public sector. So we have then a quasi-Soviet state, self-serving, self-indulgent, pious, and led by a man now who is all of those things and embodies all of them. And there's a final resemblance, as again Neil Ferguson pointed out, there's a final resemblance, of course. They subscribe to a completely absurd set of values, which, as with Soviet communism, nobody actually believes in. The whole world of woke, or indeed the idea that believing in the public service somehow gives you special insight. So, and there's a final point, I'm afraid. Starmer came to power not simply uttering the words public service as a mantra, but also uttering the word change. It is now surely perfectly clear that not only was the public service a mere cover for entitlement, the change is no change. Change Labour has utterly unchanged ideas. It simply represents an intensification of the disorganisation, of the overlapping, of the relentless incompetence, the overtaxing, the chaos of government, the incompetence of government that we've seen progressively strangling the country, really from the late 90s, from 1997 onwards. So that final Sovietization of Britain, like Gulliver, bound in Lilliput with cords which tie the giant down. Next, I want to talk about how those ties can be torn, how Gulliver, Britain, can actually be liberated from this monstrous doctrine of the public service.